my name is Scott Hogue, and today I'll be discussing the 10th anniversary of World IPv6 launch and celebrating the successes over the past decade. I'll also be talking about what remains to be accomplished in the years to come. Today I'm representing the various IPv6 task force groups in North America. After the tragic passing of Jim Bound in 2009, the North American IPv6 Task Force became a collection of geographically dispersed IPv6 groups, all with the same original mission that Jim envisioned. Early on, there were IPv6 task force groups like the Mid-Atlantic, Canadian, Hawaiian, Latin American, Caribbean groups, but these listed here are the active IPv6 task forces that support the global IPv6 forum's goals of furthering IPv6 adoption worldwide. In the past, these groups have organized IPv6 events and evangelized for the use of IPv6. I'm the Chair Emeritus of the Rocky Mountain IPv6 Task Force. First, a bit of history for those Gen Z or Gen Alpha people among us who may not know what transpired well over a decade ago. Or rather, maybe a quick refresher for those of us like me who are older and have poor memories. Well, World IPv6 Day was a 24-hour dual protocol enablement test on June 8th, 2011. It was sponsored by the Internet Society and many commercial customers to determine the impact and percentage of broken IPv6 connectivity that existed on the Internet. Thanks to improvements to products, host operating systems, connectivity, happy eyeballs, the amount of IPv6 brokenness was less than previously feared. The following year was World IPv6 launch on June 6th, 2012. And it aimed to promote permanent dual protocol enablement. So content providers like Facebook, Google, Microsoft Bing, Yahoo, Akamai, and Limelight Networks vowed to configure a Quad A record for their primary websites and leave it on permanently. Service providers like AT&T, Comcast, Free Telecom, Internode, KDDI, Time Warner Cable, and Access for All vowed to enable IPv6 for enough of their users and subscribers, at least 1% of their wireline residential subscribers would have IPv6. And equipment manufacturers like Cisco and D-Link vowed to have IPv6 capable CPE for their subscribers. This event helped break the logjam that IPv6 previously experienced. Today we celebrate the accomplishments of so many people. It's been 10 years since World IPv6 launch, and content providers have left their primary websites running dual protocol. ISPs have continued to increase their IPv6 enabled subscribers well beyond 1% to 50, 80, or even 90%. CPE vendors and many other manufacturers have given us countless IPv6 capable products. We're honoring this success and voicing our gratitude to these people and companies. And we'll be reviewing the progress. Also note, we are not taking credit for any of this progress, but rather recognizing those who have put in tremendous effort to make this happen. Without IPv6 products, we would never have IPv6 internet connectivity, content providers couldn't IPv6 enable their sites, and end users couldn't access that IPv6 enabled content. These companies, out of the goodness of their hearts, gave us IPv6 enabled products because they recognized it was the right thing to do. Now we have many categories of IPv6 enabled products, companies like Android, Google, Apple, Arista, Aruba, HPE, Broadcom, Cisco, CommScope, Fortinet, Juniper, Linux, Microsoft, Palo Alto Networks, Technicolor, VMware, among many others, have given us products that we require to further IPv6 adoption. We also have product testing organizations that are making sure that these products conform to the standards. Tier 1 ISPs and internet exchanges, we need to thank them. They've worked so hard to establish IPv6 connectivity in the fabric of the internet. Thankfully, ISPs seemingly don't charge any more for dual protocol connectivity than IPv4 only internet connectivity. Service providers recognize the inevitable transition to IPv6 and how much of the internet runs both protocols. Some service providers recognize the operational efficiencies of running single protocol core network and now have an IPv6 only core network while still facilitating IPv4 subscriber connectivity using IPv4 as a service techniques. Thanks to those exchanges and peering points for supporting the interconnection of the IPv6 internet. Credit to all of those who have IPv6 enabled root name servers. Without IPv6 enabled DNS and BGP, we couldn't have an IPv6 internet. And since World IPv6 launch, now all root name servers have both A and Quad A records. Thanks for turning IPv6 on by default. We should also give thanks to those organizations that have IPv6 enabled their authoritative name servers as well. We now have IPv6 connectivities in our pockets, purses, and packs. The majority of mobile devices have IPv6 reachability on their 4G and 5G networks, thanks to the tremendous efforts of those mobile service providers and their employees. These companies recognize that they couldn't continue to scale their businesses and support the ever-growing number of mobile devices solely using IPv4. Thanks for not making subscribers ask for IPv6 before it got enabled. IPv6 on by default? Brilliant. We apologize for excluding any company from this slide. Some service providers may not have their IPv6 subscriber numbers tracked by the World IPv6 measurement site. Also, we bold highlight companies that were part of the original World IPv6 launch participant. Now, many of us have IPv6 connectivity at our homes and businesses, thanks to the work of these residential broadband ISPs. These carriers have over 50% of their subscribers using IPv6. We highlight in bold those companies that participated in World IPv6 launch. As a result of these carrier deployments, we now have a significant number of IPv6 users in North American countries. It's estimated that we have 124 million IPv6 subscribers in the United States, 40.4 million in Mexico, 11.7 in Canada, and 3 million in Guatemala. Thanks to those companies that have IPv6 enabled their websites, now a statistically significant percentage of websites are using IPv6. Although there's much work to do here to increase the rate of IPv6 adoption for smaller sites, from this W3 text graph, we see that the higher ranked the website is, the more likely it is to use IPv6. Coincidence? Also, the World IPv6 measurement site reports that the percentage of the Alexa top 1,000 websites currently using IPv6 is around 32%. I got a fortune cookie the other day and it said 47.2% of all statistics are made up. I kind of suspect the number is higher than that. But seriously though, all we know is that IPv6 measurements are dependent on where the measurement is taken and the perspective of the internet from that vantage point. So your mileage may vary. Any IPv6 presentation would not be complete without a screenshot of the Google IPv6 statistics graph. From Google's worldwide perspective of the internet, IPv6 continues to increase at a steady pace. We want to explore how we can accelerate this. Facebook, one of the original World IPv6 launch participants, now has the majority of their internet traffic using IPv6 in many countries. These graphs show IPv6 from their members in the United States. In other words, from this graph, we can see that IPv4 is becoming the minority protocol. Many thanks to the content delivery networks that have IPv6 enabled websites around the world, in addition to improving the performance of that content. Even if the origin fetch is still happening over IPv4 only on the back end, we can still recognize the progress. We also want to recognize those CDNs that make websites reachable over IPv6 by default. My guess is that most CDN customers may not know to ask for IPv6 and may not know how to enable IPv6 CDN services themselves, so dual protocol should be the default setting. Again, I apologize if we've excluded any company here. These are the companies that came to mind, and bold highlighting shows those companies that supported the original World IPv6 launch back in 2012. Akamai also shows us IPv6 traffic percentages from their global perspective, although their statistics vary from time to time. I can't say that I'm knowledgeable about how they collect these statistics, but we can see that Akamai's connections from Mexico use IPv6 40% of the time. Also, at the very top of Akamai's IPv6 adoption statistics by country is Montserrat at 59.7%. And that's the same font that's used in this presentation. Another coincidence? I think not. Although many of these cloud service providers, with the exception of Google, weren't around back in the world IPv6 launch era, they've worked diligently to IPv6 enable their services. While the majority of their initial services offerings were IPv4, it's taken them much effort to retool those services for dual protocol connectivity. A lesson for the rest of us: when making a new product or a service, it's easier to make it dual protocol right from the start rather than add IPv6 capability as an afterthought once it's in production. While there are cloud services that enable IPv6 by default, like AWS CloudFront distributions, Microsoft Azure CDN, however, the vast majority of public cloud infrastructure as a services must have IPv6 enabled manually. And many of their customers are not enabling IPv6 within their infrastructure as code, software-driven DevOps practices. People thinking about the evolution of IPv6 transition has changed over the years. Back in 2005 to 2015, dual stack was the battle cry. Well, because tunneling just made us cry. Now, as IPv6 has evolved and shown that it can be robust, the aim is to start to use IPv6 only whenever possible. The recent US federal CIO mandate, M2107, and many countries around the world are striving to achieve IPv6 only connectivity. But for most enterprises, it seems daunting and infeasible to have IPv6 only network transport because there are still IPv4 dependencies in many IT products and services. So now what's next? What still needs to be done? What's left to do? What thorns remain? Enterprises continue to struggle with IPv6. They fail to recognize the amount of IPv6 usage on the internet used by their own remote employees, their customers, their partners, vendors, suppliers, etc. Enterprise IT personnel lack knowledge and are not seeking training to learn about the protocol, so many enterprises haven't even formulated a plan. They're confused about the number of dynamic IPv6 address assignment methods, and they want to have the same operational practices they do for IPv6 as they do for IPv4, namely DHCP. Many enterprises struggle with multi-homing without BGP. They have a tendency and want to use NAT66 because it's what they're familiar with. And thanks to those VPN providers who provide privacy for both v4 and v6, we know who you are, we appreciate you, but you don't need to keep your IPv6 capabilities such a secret. CDNs, clouds, hosting providers may not be turning IPv6 on by default. Their customers, just like the website users, don't want to have to ask about IPv6, and they may not know even what IPv6 is and why they should even ask in the first place. There's still well-documented and frequently discussed issues related to handling of IPv6 packets with extension headers and fragmentation headers, although we see hope in this topic. There's also going to be an IPv6 panel of experts later today who are going to cover these topics more deeply about where we go from here. So we applaud all of your efforts. Thank you. We recognize all the hard work that went into getting us to this point, the countless hours, the testing, the configuration preparations, the late night change windows that led to where we are today. Or maybe you just cowboyed IPv6 in during a change window during the day. It's IPv6 after all. So I'll pause for a moment while you all give yourself a round of applause. Now we can't stop now. The mission isn't accomplished. There's much work that remains to get us to the ideal IPv6 on by default and IPv6 only end state. As we in the task forces like to say, forget your A game, now it's time to bring your quad A game. If ever you need to contact the North American IPv6 task force groups, here's how to reach us. Here's my contact information if you have any IPv6 related questions for me. Thank you very much for your time and all that you have done to further IPv6 adoption over the recent decade. Now I'll be able to answer IPv6 related questions you may have.
Thank you, Scott. Very good. Do we have any questions for Scott. And Scott is joining us live via Zoom. Welcome, Scott.
Hi, everybody.
Nothing on the Q&A tab. Oh, we have one in the audience down there. Go ahead, sir. Mike.
On? Hi, I'm Josh Oakes from Telstra. One of the things I noticed was the residential broadband users were significantly lower than other organizations in overall adoption. What can we do to help nudge them along with, bringing the eyeballs into to adoption of IPv6?
I think the service providers, continue to upgrade their infrastructure, their broadband network gateways, their DSLAMs, their CMTSs. There's continuing work to upgrade the software and upgrade those systems. Need to get subscribers to churn the CPE. We need a little more electrical spikes in power to kill the little $2 power adapter on those devices to cause refresh. Many CPE devices, like I mentioned, like CDNs or an IaaS provider, may not come with IPv6 enabled by default. IPv6 may need to be something that the subscriber needs to go in and turn on their little, home router. If it's not integrated, if that device is integrated, if the router is integrated with the, cable modem or DSL modem, then it's easy for the service provider to have some control over that and turn on IPv6 by default. But for many subscriber purchase devices, they may need to go in and turn that on by default. So we really need to encourage CPE manufacturers to have, IPv6 enabled by default on those devices. That would help.
Thank you.
Thank you. We got one more stepping up.
Hi, this is Michael Costello from Netflix. So a lot of the things that you touched on were about enabling V6 in more places. And during the keynote today, there was the question of, besides the IPv4 reachability, does IPv6 work for consumers? And the answer was sadly no. And so often, even now, 10 years in, we're seeing that the first step in troubleshooting V6 is to disable it. So what are the things that the people in this room could be doing? What are some concrete steps we can take to make the V6 experience less broken and less of a second-class citizen?
I'd say, improve, well, it's important to, training is so important. Training is important for, for help desk folks. They need to be knowledgeable about IPv6 so they don't, go to that knee-jerk reaction of just disabling it because they don't understand it. So understanding is one. Understanding the protocol that they're troubleshooting is important because maybe they could resolve the problem faster instead of just turning it off. Two, they need tools to give them visibility and the ability to troubleshoot. They don't just need to do a ping over v4 and a ping over v6. That's two steps. What if they just did a single ping command and it pinged all the addresses that responded to a fully qualified domain name, whether that was v4 or v6 or both? We need tools to be able to do both and test both automatically to reduce the mean time to repair. If we had knowledge, tools, visibility, techniques, procedures, I think we could resolve problems faster and not have to move to that, turn off IPv6 and that fixed it, solution. Those are my ideas off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And that wraps it up.